Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise tonight to speak about a confronting issue, one that's been taboo, because it's so awful and so unjust that Australians would prefer to pretend that it's not happening. But it's time that all of us face the awful truth about the scourge of violence against women and children happening right here in our homes, our streets, our cities, our nation. It's been in the media a lot lately, the escalating numbers of women and children who've lost their lives from violence by men. So many women, so often. Those horrific stories have left the community shocked and outraged, and yet the cases that get reported are only a fraction of what Australian women face. Domestic violence is insidious, pervasive and mostly hidden. Each year, May is Domestic Violence Prevention Month. The reported statistics, themselves bound to underestimate the real extent of the problem, are that 1 in 5 women have experienced domestic violence by a partner since the age of 15. In Australia, 2/3 of all women who are murdered are killed by their husband or live-in partner. Domestic violence is more than just physical or sexual abuse, of course. It's also about control. Domestic violence is about social, financial, emotional and verbal manipulation and control to make women powerless. It scares me that it can be so difficult for women to get out of situations of domestic violence. After years of abuse, a victim will often be isolated from their friends and family, cut off from financial support, have no options for alternative housing, and may be emotionally dependent upon the person who's manipulated them into the situation. The work of organisations such as White Ribbon, encouraging boys and men to lead social change in the anti-domestic violence movement, is so important. Because of the prevalence of abuse in our society, we're going to need significant cultural shift if we're going to curb domestic violence. Many men are aware of domestic violence occurring within their communities, and I applaud those men, all those men who've stood strong against their peers to stop violence against women. And I encourage all men to do so, whether at the pub, at work or in the home. It's vital we end this pattern by breaking the silence and speaking out against controlling or sexist behaviour and violence. The Greens strongly support the White Ribbon campaign for working with men to try and deliver lasting cultural change, but it's also time for women to break the silence. We need to help our sisters, mothers, grandmothers and friends speak out against domestic violence and support them to seek help. We need to make the taboo public, to face its prevalence and to bravely say enough is enough. As one small contribution to Domestic Violence Prevention Month, I've started a social media campaign to encourage women to anonymously share their stories so that we can help increase awareness of the prevalence of domestic violence in our society. I committed to sharing those stories to make sure they get heard, and they are heartbreaking. I only have time to share a couple of them tonight. Obviously they're edited and the names have been changed. A young woman in her 20s wrote to me, let's call her Eve. She says, I've been with my now ex for almost 12 years. I've suffered at his hands, beatings, floggings, verbal abuse, emotional abuse. I remember meeting him at 17. At first our relationship was great. Looking back, I realised the little things that he did slowly make me lose confidence and gain fear for upsetting him. He grew up thinking violent attacks on your partner were normal. I did not. By the time I wanted to get out of the relationship, I was heavily pregnant. My family didn't know how to support me, and I was so scared I stayed. Being pregnant certainly didn't stop the violence. I can remember at 8 months being whipped with a metal dog chain. Survival and protecting my stomach were my only concerns. The lows were followed by the sorries and affection. The promises never seemed to be fulfilled. I loved the nice, caring person he could be, but feared the person that he could become, drugs and alcohol making him much more violent and aggressive person. The violent beatings continued for years. Eve escaped and he followed, and then one night he beat her and kicked her and assaulted her 2-year-old, for which he at least received a year in jail. She lost the baby that she was carrying due to the assault. After being in the relationship for 12 years, Eve finally permanently separated from her husband after escaping a particularly violent episode. She says, I can't live my life waiting for the day he decides to kill me. My kids need me. 3 weeks after the episode, she felt ashamed to go out in public because of her bruises. And when she did go out in public, she was judged. She was asked, what did she do to provoke him? It's up to this parliament to make sure that people like Eve get the support that they need, and it's up to every Australian to ensure that women are never blamed for the abuse perpetrated against them. The other story that I'll share tonight is from a woman that we'll call Joanna, and she's worried that domestic violence is wrongly seen as a problem that only affects a certain type of person. She was brought up in a normal family, she had a normal social life with friends, she was happy with her body and with her life in general. When she was in her mid-20s, she met a man and shortly afterwards moved away from her hometown to be with him, and he turned out to be a heavy drinker. She says, "It wasn't long before he started telling me that I was overweight and had me scared to eat. I was only a size 8 and weighed 53 kilograms. Eventually he hit me, not once but a few times. He would hold my head up against the times in the shower and make me swallow water until I was choking. I left him, he wasn't happy. He threatened that he would make my life a misery if I didn't go back to him, so I moved back in." One night after he'd been drinking with a mate at their home, she says, "He asked me to come into the bedroom. He began to use my head and my body as a punching bag, throwing my head up against the heavy brick walls. I was screaming and begging for help, but his mate sat in the lounge room and ignored my pleas for help. Eventually 2 off-duty policemen that lived upstairs came to my rescue. He ran off and they took me to hospital. I had a face like the Elephant Man and my nose was broken. His mate was horrified when he saw me, but he had sat by while it happened. This is where the problem lies, the acceptability of this type of behaviour amongst men. I moved out, he found me, threatened to kill me. I kept moving and thankfully he gave up. 25 years later, I still cringe when I walk down the main street in case I see him." As Joanna says, the problem lies with the acceptability of this type of behaviour amongst men. And while the government's election commitment to $1 million for White Ribbon is welcoming, assuming that it is indeed in the budget papers tonight, much more is going to be needed to drive the deep cultural change needed to tackle domestic violence. The total federal budget for women's safety, which includes the National Action Plan to reduce violence against women and their children, was just $29.5 million in this current financial year. By way of comparison, when the then government in 2011 decided to prioritise improving services and social awareness and acceptance of mental health issues, another deserving issue, they put $2.2 billion towards the problem. Now, the Greens support the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, but we share the concerns of many groups working in the sector that the plan needs to be implemented more rapidly and it needs to be funded. The Greens are committed to supporting women's shelters, to funding integrated domestic violence response programs, to increasing the New Start allowance and single parenting payments, unlike what we saw tonight, and to addressing the rental affordability crisis that sees women and children escaping violence condemned to homelessness because of the up to 500,000 shortage of affordable and available rental properties. We also need to ensure that there is real, affordable and available access to legal justice for women and to address the even greater amount of domestic violence that Aboriginal women face. We need to double the funding for Indigenous family violence prevention programs and to increase the funding for Indigenous legal services. We need to give women and children the support they need and the ability to escape from an abusive household and to be able to afford to stay free from violence. A budget that does not do that is a budget that continues the silence on domestic violence and condemns those women and children to violence. The Greens and domestic violence prevention experts across the country will be scrutinising the budget papers released tonight to see where this government stands when it comes to stopping the scourge of DV in our communities. And when a government decides to spend $12 billion on joint strike fighters, it had better find some more money to help women escape violence and to make preventing domestic violence a national priority. During this month, I'll be seeking to hear more from the organisations working directly with women and children impacted by domestic violence and to learn more about what our governments and the broader community needs to do. I'll be visiting victim support centres and being briefed by community organisations working in Queensland, and I encourage all senators to do the same. No one should live in fear, and enough is enough. It's time for all of us to be the answer.